Have you ever stopped to think about what happens when someone simply disappears? I'm not talking about death, not yet. I'm talking about that moment when you enter a room and find an empty space where there should be a presence. A tidy, impeccable hospital bed, but with no one there. And suddenly, that emptiness screams louder than any word ever could. Because emptiness doesn't lie. It doesn't pretend. It simply reveals everything you've spent years trying to hide. That's what I want to talk to you about today, about a family that had everything: money, power, status, that perfect image that everyone envied from afar. But behind the doors of the mansion, behind the smiles in the magazine photos, there was a deafening silence. The kind of silence that corrodes from within slowly, like invisible rust destroying a structure that seems solid until the day it simply crumbles. And that's exactly what happened. An empty bed in a private hospital became the trigger for a fall that no one saw coming, or perhaps everyone saw it, but pretended not to because it was more comfortable that way. Because admitting that something is broken means having to fix it, and fixing it hurts. It takes courage. It takes looking in the mirror and acknowledging that you may have spent years, even decades, building the wrong life. Stay with me until the end of this story, because what you're about to discover isn't just about a wealthy family and their secrets. It's about all of us, about the choices we make when we think we have infinite time, about the price we pay when we trade truth for appearances, love for convenience, presence for provision. About that brutal moment when life forces you to answer questions you've spent your whole life avoiding. Have you ever been through this? Have you ever had that moment when you realized you were living on autopilot, doing everything right on paper, but everything wrong when it really matters? Have you ever felt that tightness in your chest when you understood that people you love are by your side but aren't really with you? That you live in the same house but inhabit completely different worlds? This is the story of the Castellani family. A family that seemed to have won at life, but was actually losing the most important game of all without even realizing it. And everything came to light because of an empty bed. A space that should have been occupied, but wasn't. An absence that revealed all the other absences, the emotional ones, the affective ones, the ones that hurt the most because we choose to ignore them. What really happened in that hospital? Why was that bed left empty? And most importantly, what did that family discover about themselves when there were no more masks to wear? When money could no longer buy easy ways out? When all that remained was the stark truth? I'll tell you, but I'm warning you. This isn't a comfortable story. It's not one of those you watch, forget, and move on from. It's the kind that sticks too. That makes you think about your own choices, your own empty beds, those parts of your life that should be full of meaning, but are hollow. Because we all have our empty beds, don't we? Those spaces we pretend not to see, that relationship that only exists on paper. That job that pays the bills but kills the soul. That family gathered around the same table, but each one lost in their own cell phone, their own world, their own lies. And the question this story poses, the question that empty bed silently screams, is simple and terrifying at the same time. How long will you pretend everything is all right? How long will you wait to choose differently? Because spoiler alert, nobody has infinite time. And when time runs out, what remains is not the money you amassed, not the empire you built, not the image you projected. What remains are the real moments you lived or failed to live. The words you said or swallowed, the love you gave or withheld. The Castellani family learned this the hard way, and what happened to them after that bed became empty changed everything. Absolutely everything. Some found redemption. Others paid prices they never imagined they would have to pay. But none of them came out the same as they went in. Because truths like that, when they finally explode, either destroy you completely or transform you into something new. So take a deep breath, because what you're about to discover might surprise you, it might disturb you, it might even make you pause the video to process it, but I promise you one thing, it will be worth every second. Because sometimes we need to see the broken mirror of someone else's life to finally see the cracks in our own. And if this topic is already making sense to you, if you're already recognizing something in your own life while reading this, I need to ask you something. Leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far. What is the empty space in your life? That part that seems perfect on the outside, but you know is hollow inside, because your story matters just as much as the Castellanis. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to read today to have the courage to change. And look, I know it sounds silly, leaving a comment. What difference does it make? But it makes all the difference. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. People who may be going through the same thing as you, who feel alone in their own struggles, who need to know that they are not the only ones facing difficult truths. Every like, every comment, every new subscription to the channel means that more people will have access to stories that show that being human is complicated, but that transformation is possible. So if you want to keep following stories like this real raw, that aren't afraid to delve into what really matters, subscribe to the channel now. Because I promise to bring you more content that makes you think, feel, and question, not those superficial stories with easy endings, but the ones that truly move you, that stay with you long after the video ends. Now let's go back to the Castellani family. Let's go back to that empty bed and find out what really happened there. Because the story is only just beginning, and what you'll discover about this family and perhaps about yourself will still surprise you several times before the end. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what happened in that hospital room wasn't an accident. It wasn't a fatality. It was the result of 30 years of silent decisions, the kind we make every day without realizing the real impact they'll have later on. You know when you look at a situation and think, how did it get to this point? That's exactly it. The hidden truth behind that empty bed was that it didn't suddenly become empty. It emptied gradually, over decades, while everyone pretended everything was fine. Helena Castellani should have been in that bed. The doctors expected her there. The family expected her there. But when they opened the door to the room that morning, they found only silence and perfectly arranged sheets, as if no one had ever been there. And it was at that moment that the mask fell, because it's one thing to maintain the illusion of a perfect family when everyone is present, smiling in photos, feigning unity. It's quite another when someone simply disappears and forces you to confront all the questions you've been avoiding for years. Bernardo looked at that empty bed and for the first time in decades he didn't have a ready answer, a plan of action, a business solution. The children looked at that space and felt the weight of all the conversations they never had, of all the I love yous that remained stuck in their throats, of all the times they chose comfort over truth. Because that empty bed was asking the question no one wanted to answer. Where were you when she needed you most? And even more importantly, why did she choose to leave alone instead of staying with you? To understand what really happened in that hospital, we need to go back in time. 32 years ago, when Helena and Bernardo met at one of those boring corporate events where nobody really wants to be. She was an architect, talented, full of dreams. He was the heir to a construction empire, ambitious, intense, magnetic. And what began as true passion gradually transformed into something completely different, because the hidden truth about relationships is that they don't break suddenly. They crack slowly, silently, while we go about our routines pretending the cracks don't exist. Bernardo worked 18 hours a day. Business trips were more frequent than nights at home. And Helena, who was once a brilliant architect with a strong voice, gradually became just Bernardo Castellani's wife. That subtle transformation that happens when you give up pieces of yourself in order to keep the peace. Not to interfere with his plans to be the perfect wife that society expects. The children were born: Raphael, Marina, Julia. 3 children growing up in a gigantic mansion with everything money could buy, except the real presence of their father. And Helena tried to compensate. She tried to be both mother and father at the same time. She tried to fill the voids with double the love. But love doesn't work that way. You can't love for two people. And it was in this void that her mindset began to change. That's when Ricardo entered the story. The landscape designer, 12 years younger, who looked at her as a woman, not as a trophy wife. The affair lasted 8 months. 8 months of agonizing guilt mixed with the feeling of being alive for the first time in years. Until Bernardo found out, and instead of a scandal, there was a cold agreement. They would remain married because divorce was inconvenient for business. That was the decision that sealed their fate, and it was precisely this cold agreement, this decision to maintain appearances at all costs, that planted the seeds of what would come later. Because when you build an entire life on neatly arranged lies, eventually the foundation gives way. And that's what happened when that bed became empty. Suddenly, there was no more pretending. There was no mask left to hold it together. 3 days after Helena disappeared from that hospital, the family was forcibly gathered in the mansion's living room, not of their own volition, but because the lawyer summoned everyone to read something Helena had left behind, a letter. And when those words began to be read aloud, it was as if a bomb exploded in slow motion. Helena exposed everything, every lie, every silent betrayal. Every moment someone chose comfort over courage. She confronted Bernardo for his coldness, for turning love into a business transaction. She confronted Rafael for becoming an even crueler version of his father, ending things with the only woman who truly loved him because she didn't fit the profile needed for business. She confronted Marina for accepting a marriage where she was repeatedly betrayed, perpetuating the same cycle of submission she herself had lived. And she confronted Julia, the youngest, who screamed for attention through drugs and self-destruction while everyone pretended not to see. Helena's physical absence from that bedside brought the brutal presence of regret. Because it's funny how we only realize what we've lost when there's no chance of getting it back. At that moment, faced with that devastating letter, each of them had to look in the mirror and confront the hidden truth they had been avoiding. They weren't the perfect family from the magazines. They were strangers living in the same house, united only by surname and shared guilt. And for the first time, there was nowhere to hide from this revelation. What happened after reading that letter was something no one expected. There were no dramatic explosions. There were no screams. There was only a heavy silence, laden with everything that had never been said. And it was in that silence that each one began to process the true weight of their own choices. Bernardo was the first to break. This man who had spent 58 years building an image of unwavering strength, who never allowed himself to show weakness, who believed that providing was the same as loving, finally crumbled. He cried for the marriage he let die while building an empire. He cried for having transformed the woman he loved into a ghost version of herself. And he cried because he finally understood that love is not what you feel, it's what you do. And he had done so little. Meanwhile, Marina looked at her own life and saw a perfect mirror of her mother. She had accepted betrayals. She had swallowed humiliations. She had smiled in photos while dying inside. All because she had learned that a woman from a good family doesn't separate, doesn't cut scandals, doesn't put dignity above convenience. But at that moment, faced with her mother's words begging her not to make the same mistakes, something changed. Her mindset changed, and she realized she was teaching her own daughters that love means accepting crumbs. Rafael was drunk in a seedy bar, dialing Carolina's number after 6 years. 6 years since he broke up with the only woman who truly saw him, because she didn't fit the corporate profile. And now, too late, he understood that he had traded something real for something empty, that he had followed his father's script without questioning, and the result was a life of external achievements and complete internal desolation. And Julia, the youngest, was sitting on the floor of a Narcotics Anonymous meeting for the first time without being forced. She finally understood that all the self-destruction, all the drugs, all the toxic relationships were just desperate cries for attention in a family that had forgotten how to listen, and for The first time, she wasn't screaming. She was talking truly, admitting she was broken, but wanting to rebuild herself. Because her mother's letter had said something no one had ever said before. You don't need to scream anymore. I heard you. What happened in the following months was a transformation that no one could have predicted. Bernardo sold the mansion and moved into a smaller apartment. He began visiting Helena at the hospice every day, finally having the real conversations they should have had 30 years ago. Marina filed for divorce that same week, choosing dignity over security. Rafael quit his job, lost but honest for the first time in his life. And Julia completed 90 days clean, one day at a time, rebuilding herself from the rubble. When Helena finally died, with Bernardo holding her hand and the sun rising through the window, she departed in peace because she had done what she needed to do. She had forced that family to wake up, and they woke up. It wasn't a happy ending in the traditional sense. Happy endings are easy and shallow. It was an honest ending. An ending where each one had to pay the price for their own choices, but also gained the chance to choose differently from then on. Because that empty bed wasn't about death. It was about what you do with the time you still have. About having the courage to change before it's too late. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this story resonated with you. Maybe you recognized a piece of your own journey in the Castellani. Maybe you saw yourself in one of these characters, or someone you love. And if that's the case, I want to ask you something. Leave a comment below about what you would do in their place. If you were standing before your own empty bed, what choice would you make differently? Right, this message was for me if this story truly touched you, because I want to know that you're there on the other side, that we're in this conversation together. And look, if this content resonated with you, if it made you think, feel, or question something in your own life, leave a like below. It's not just a button, you know? It's you saying that this kind of story matters, that it's worth continuing to bring this content that goes deep, that isn't afraid to talk about the difficult side of being human. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now's the time. Because here we don't make superficial content. We bring stories that transform, that move you, that stay with you after the video ends, stories about choices, consequences, redemption, and everything that really matters when we take off the masks. And there's a video over here that complements everything we've talked about today. Click and continue with me there, because the journey doesn't end here. We still have a lot to explore together about how our decisions shape who we become. See you there.